Hello, everybody. I hope y'all are having a wonderful day and a good start to your Halloween season. This is my first ever post-commentary content on a video that I am doing. As I said before, I am going to tell a spooky story, or try to tell a spooky story. So I want to go ahead and begin quickly so we can talk about it a little later if I have the time. This story is in the Irbygia saga, starting all the way in chapter 51, where Thorgunna dies. I'm going to try and go slow with pronunciation so that the microphone can hear it a little bit clearly, and that there's no mispronunciations made, because making subtitles would probably be for this. Oh, well, I'll bleep that out. Okay. The summer was wet, but there were good drying spells in the autumn once the home meadow at Fordor had been mown, and nearly half of that hay was fully dry. One day was ideal for drying, calm and clear, with not a cloud in sight. Thorod was up early that morning and arranged the work for the day. Some of the farm hands were to cart the hay home, and the others were to stack it. He told the woman to help with the drying of the hay, and shared out the work between them. Thorgunna was given as much hay to dry as would have been winter fodder for an ox. Everything went smoothly to begin with, but in the early afternoon a black cloud began to form in the north, just above Skor, and soon it swept across the sky, making sight for the farmstead. It looked as if the cloud would bring rain, and Thorod told them to start stacking the hay, but Thorgunna kept turning hers as hard as she could, and refused to begin stacking it even though she had been told to. The dark cloud raced across the sky, and when it was just over the farmstead of Fordriver, things were so overcast they could see nothing beyond the meadow, and hardly an arm's length inside it. After that there was such a heavy cloudburst, and that all the hay on the ground was drenched. The clouds vanished suddenly, and when the weather cleared up again, they saw that the shower had been one of blood. In the evening there was a fine drying spell, and the blood dried quickly, except for on the hay that Thorgunna had spread. Neither this nor the rake she had used would dry. Thorod asked Thorgunna what this omen could mean, but she said she couldn't tell. "Most likely it forebodes the death of someone here," she said. Thorgunna went home in the evening straight to bed. She took off the blood-soaked clothes she was wearing, lied down on the bed, and gave a heavy sigh. People could see that she had been taken ill. The shower had fallen nowhere else, only on Fordriver. Thorgunna refused food that evening. Next morning, Thorod went to go see her about her illness, and find out that she thought she might be feeling well. She said that she believed this illness would be her last. "I found you to be the most sensible person here," she said, "and that's why I'm telling you what to do with the things I leave behind. You may not think much of me, but everything I tell you will turn out exactly as I say, and nothing good will come of it if you don't follow my wishes. This first omen is a clear indication that something serious is bound to happen unless every step is taken to prevent it." "You're probably not far from the truth," said Thorod. "I promise to follow all of your instructions." "Here's what I want," said Thorgunna. "Should I die of this illness, I want my body taken to Skalholt, because something tells me that it will soon be the most venerated place in the land. I know that there are priests there to sing mass for me as well, and that's why I want you to take me there. In return, you can have sufficient of my belongings to repay you handsomely for all the trouble. But before you start dividing up my property, Thurid is to have the scarlet cloak. I'm doing this to make her less unhappy about the disposal of the rest of my things. Next, out of all things I'm leaving you with, take whatever you and your wife want most to cover the expenses." There is a gold ring of mine which must be given to the church. But my bed and all its furnishings I want burned to ashes, for they never do anyone much good. I'm not saying this because I grudge these things to anyone who could use them. But I must be firm about it. I wouldn't like to be responsible for all the trouble people will bring on themselves if they don't respect my wishes. Thorod promised to do all that she asked him. Man. Soon after, her illness took a turn for the worse, and she lingered on only a few days before she died. The body was taken to the church, and Thorod had a coffin made for it. Next day he carried the bedcloths outside, gathered some firewood, and made a bonfire. When his wife Thurid came and asked what he was up to, he said he was going to burn them, just as Thorgunna had asked. If I have my way, she said, I am not having you burn valuable stuff like this. She meant every word when she said it. It wouldn't do it. Okay. She meant every word when she said it. It wouldn't do to ignore her warning, said Thorod. It only goes to show what an envious woman she was, said Thurid. She was too mean to let anyone enjoy them, and that's why she told you to do it. Whatever we decided to do, I can't see what harm can come of it. I don't think ignoring her wishes will do us much good, he said. But Thurid put her arms around his neck and begged him not to burn the bed furnishings. She kept pleading with him until he agreed only to destroy the eiderdown and pillows. While Thurid took the quilt and bed curtains and the canopy, all the same, neither of them felt really happy about it. After they got ready to send the corpse off for burial. For the journey, Thorod chose men he could rely on and gave them his best horses. The corpse was wrapped in an unstitched linen shroud and laid in a coffin. They set off taking the usual route south across the moor, and nothing much happened on their journey till they came south of Valbjarnarvellir. As they crossed the Soden moorland there, the pack horse kept throwing off the coffin. It kept throwing off the coffin. Excuse me, first time telling a story. On they went south to the Norder River at the cross at the Irjarfjord, through the very deep water. The weather was squally with sleet and heavy rain. Eventually they came to a farm called Netherness in Stafholtstungur and asked to stay the night, but the farmer refused to give them hospitality. It was getting very late, and they thought that they could go no further, as it seemed unwise to risk fording the Pivot River at night. So they unloaded the horse, carried the coffin into the storehouse near the door, walked into the living room, and took off their clothes, intended to spend the night there, without food if necessary. The household went to bed before it grew dark. They hadn't been long in their beds when they heard loud noises coming from the larder. Some of them went to see if thieves had broken into the house. When they came into the larder, there was a tall woman, stark naked, not a stitch of clothing on her, getting a meal ready. The people of the household were too scared when they saw her to come anywhere near. As soon as the corpse bearers heard about it, they went to see them for themselves what was going on. The woman was Thorgunna, and everyone else thought it best to leave her in peace. When she had finished doing what she wanted in the larder, she carried the food into the living room and laid the table and served the meal. Before we part, you may end up very sorry that you didn't treat us with more hospitality, said the corpse bearers to the farmer. We'll gladly give you food and anything else you need, said the farmer and his wife. And as soon as the farmer had made them welcome, Thorgunna walked out of the room and didn't reappear. Now a lamp was lit in the living room, and the travelers were helped out of their wet clothes and given dry things. They sat down at the table and made no signs, and made the sign of the cross over the food. And the farmer had every corner of the house sprinkled with holy water. The travelers ate their food, and it did them no harm at all, even though it had been prepared by Thorgunna. They spent a very comfortable night there. In the morning they got ready to be on their way, and the rest of the journey without a hitch. Everyone who heard of what happened at the farm thought it'd be best to give them what they asked for, and nothing else happened on the journey. They came to Skalholt and handed over the precious gifts Thorgunna had left for the church there, which the priests accepted with pleasure. So Thorgunna was buried, and the corpse bearers set off home. They had an easy journey and got back safely. Now comes the interesting and most important part of the story. The farm at Fordriver had a large living room with a bed closet behind it. As was usual in those days, in the front of the living room there were 2 storerooms on either side of the door. One was for dried fish and the other for flour. They used to have a great fire burning in the living room every evening, and people would sit beside it for hours on end before they had their evening meal. The evening the corpse bearers came back, the people at Fordriver were sitting by the fireside when they saw a half-moon appear on the paneled wall. Everyone could see it. The moon kept circling around the room, back from left to right, and stayed in sight as long as people remained at the fire. Thorod asked Thorir Woodleg what it meant, and Thorir said it was fatal moon. "There'll be deaths here," he added. It went on like this for a whole week. Every evening the same weird moon appeared in the living room. The next thing to happen was that the shepherd came home one day badly shaken. He had little to say, but when he did speak, he was very ill-tempered. He fought shy of other people and kept muttering to himself, so everyone thought he must have been bewitched. This went on for some time. When 2 weeks of winter had passed, he came home one evening, went straight to bed and lied down. Next morning, when people went to see him, they found him dead. He was buried at the church there, and not long afterwards, massive hauntings began to take place. One night, Thorir Woodleg went out to the prairie to ease himself, and when he was on the way back to the house, he saw the shepherd standing at the front door. Thorir tried to get inside, but the shepherd barred his way. Thorir began to walk away, but the shepherd came after him, picked him up and threw him hard against the door. This gave Thorir a nasty shock and a good many bruises, but he struggled back to bed. Later he became ill, then died, and was buried at the church there. After that, the pair of them, Thorir Woodleg and the shepherd, were often seen together, and as you might expect, people were terrified. After Thorir's death, one of Thorod's farmhands fell ill. He lay in bed for 3 days and then he died. Soon, people started dying one after another, 6 of them in all. This was just about the beginning of the Advent, but in those days people in Iceland didn't observe the fast. The storeroom was stacked so full with dried fish that the door would hardly open. The pile of fish went right up to the crossbeam, and people had to use a ladder to get at it from above. Then things started happening. Night after night, people were sitting at the fire. They could hear something tearing at the dried fish. But when they went to look, not a living thing could be seen there. That winter, shortly before Christmas, Thorod went out to Ness to get more dried fish for himself. There were 6 of them together in a 10-oared boat, and they spent the night at Ness. In the evening, after Thorod had gone, and the fire had been lit, people came into the living room and saw a seal's head coming up through the floor. One of the servants was the first to notice this as she came in. She grabbed a club in the doorway and hit the seal on the head, which only made it rise up out of the ground a little more. Then it turned its eyes towards the canopy from Thorgunna's bed. From Thorgunna's bed, one of the farmhands came up and started hitting the seal, but it kept rising further up with every blow, until its flippers emerged. At that, the man fainted. Everyone was paralyzed with horror, except for a young Kartan, who rushed up with a sledgehammer and struck the seal on the head. It was a powerful blow, but the seal only shook its head and gazed around. Kartan went on hammering the head and driving it down like a nail into the floor until the seal disappeared. When he flattened out the floor above its head, throughout the winter, it was always the same story. Kjartan was the only one who could put fear into the ghosts. The next morning, Thorod and his men put out from nest with their dried fish, and they drowned off any. The boat and the fish were washed ashore there, but their bodies were never found. When the news came to Fordrever, Kjartan and Thurid invited their neighbors to a funeral feast at which they used the Christmas ale. On the first evening of the feast, when all the guests were seated, Thorod and his companions came. Into the room, drenched to the skin. Everyone welcomed Thorod and his men, and thought this a happy omen, because in those days it was believed that drowned people had been taken, or have been believed to be well received by the sea goddess Lan if they came to their own funeral feast. At that time, a good many heathen beliefs still prevailed, though people were baptized and supposed to be Christians. Thorod and his men walked across the main room, which had 2 doors, and into the living room. They ignored the greeting of people gave them and sat down at the fire. The people ran out of the living room, but Thorod and his men stayed until the fire began to burn very low. Then went away. As long as the funeral feast lasted, this continued. Every evening the drowned men would come to the fire. It gave people at the feast plenty to talk about, but some of them thought it would stop once the feast was over. After the feast, all the guests went back home, and the place seemed rather dull without them. In the evening, after the guests had gone, the fire in the living room was lit as usual, and as soon as it became ablaze, Thorod and his companions came in, all of them soaking wet still. They sat down at the fire and began squeezing the water out of their clothes. No sooner had they taken their seats than Thorir and Woodleg himself and his 6 companions came into the room, all of them covered with earth. They started shaking the dirt from their clothes and throwing mud at Thorod and his men. The people ran out of the room, as you would expect, and that evening they had to do without light, heating stones, and everything else fire provided. Next evening they lit a fire in another room, hoping the dead men would not come there, but things turned out otherwise. Everything happened just as before, and both parties came to sit by the fire. On the 3rd evening, Kjartan suggested they should light a long fire in the living room and another in a separate room for the household. So they tried that. As it turned out, Thorod and the other dead men came and sat at the long fire, while the living sat at the smaller one, and so it continued throughout the Christmas season. By the time the noises from the fish pile had grown much louder, and the day and night people could hear the fish being torn up, soon the time came for the fish to be eaten, and they had to look at the pile. Someone got on top of it and saw a tail sticking out. It had the look of a singed oxtail, but was covered with short seal hair. The man on the stack took hold of it. First he tried to pull it out himself, then called for the others to come and help him. Several people, men and women, joined him on the stack and kept pulling at the tail, but they couldn't get it to budge, not even an inch. Everybody thought the tail was dead, but as they were struggling to get it out, the tail tore right through their hands, and the skin was ripped from the palms of those who had been pulling hardest. The tail was never seen again. They started clearing the fish out of the storeroom, and when they had got down into the pile, they saw all the meat had been torn off the fish and only the skins were left behind. but no sign of a living creature in it anywhere. Shortly afterwards, Thorgrima, Witchface, Thorir Woodleg's widow, fell ill, and after a short spell in bed, she died. On the very same evening of her burial, she was seen in her husband's company. Then the sickness had been raging when the fairy tale had made its first appearance broke out again, this time killing more women than men. 6 people died, one after another, and the hauntings and night walkings drove others away from the farm. There had been 30 servants there in the autumn. 18 of them died, 5 more ran away by midwinter. There were only 7 of them left. After these weird events had been going on for some time, Kjartan had set off one day over to Helgafell to see his uncle Snorri and asked his advice about what should be done to put an end to them. At that time, there was a priest staying in Helgafell, sent to Snorri by Gizur the White. Snorri asked the priest to go with Kjartan to Fordriver, along with his son Thord the cat and 6 other people. They must burn the canopy from Thorgunna's bed, said Snorri, and then summon all of the dead at the door court. After that, the priest was to sing mass, consecrate water, and hear people's confessions. They rode over to Fordriver, and on the way they asked the neighbors to come with them. It was a Candlemas Eve when they came to Fordriver, and the fire had just been lit. Thurid had been taken with the same illness as those who had died. Kjartan went straight into the living room and saw Thorod and the other dead people sitting by the fire as usual. He pulled down the canopy from Thorgunna's bed, plucked a brand from the fire, and went out and burnt the ashes of all the bed furnishings that had once belonged to Thorgunna. Next, Kjartan summoned Thorir Woodleg, and Thord the cat summoned Thorod for trespassing on the home and robbing a people of life and death. All of the dead ones at the fire were summoned in the same way. Then the door court was held and the charges made, the proper procedure of an ordinary law courts being observed throughout. The jury was appointed, testimonies was taken, and cases were summed up and referred for judgment. As sentences was being passed, Thorir Woodleg rose to his feet. "I sat here as long as people would let me," he said, then went out through the other door where the court was not being held. After that, sentence was passed on the shepherd, and he stood up. "I'll go now," he said, "and it seems I should have gone sooner." Then Thorgrima, Witchface, heard her sentence and stood up too. "I stayed as long as you'd let me," she said. So they all were sentenced one after another, and as such they were sentenced, they got up and made the same remark, and left the room. It was clear that none of them wanted to leave. Thorod was the last to be sentenced. When he heard the judgment, he stood up. "There's no peace here," he said. We best all be on our way." And with that he walked out. Then Kjartan and the others went back inside, and the priests carried holy water and sacred relics to every corner of the house. Next day he sang all the prayers and celebrated Mass with great solemnity, and then there were no more dead men haunting Fordriver after that. Thurid began to improve and got well again. In the spring, after all these strange events, Kjartan engaged new servants. He farmed at Fordriver for a long time, and the people thought him to be a very courageous man. I do hope you all enjoyed that story. It is a pretty interesting one. I have 6 minutes left, so I want to talk about part of the ghost story itself. These were said to be ghosts, but yet they seem to have a physical form. And a physical form that could actually touch people. For as it said, Thorir Woodleg was tossed by the shepherd and was given a great scare and shock and bruises. So were these Drengar? I don't think so. It is really unclear what type of corpses, the living corpses these were, but they were obviously unsettled spirits that found comfort and peace at a fire. And it didn't seem that they were unwanted, as they said. They were allowed to sit there for as long as they'd let them. They were never driven out until they actually did an actual motherfucking ghost court, which I found to be funny. But that's Christianity for you. As it said, this is the time Iceland was beginning to adopt Christianity. But the one thing I also want to talk about was the long-necked seal creature that scared everybody and ate all the fish to the point where there was nothing but the skin. All the flesh had been eaten off the bone, and nothing but skin remained. That had an ox-like tail with weird seal hairs on it. I think this was more of a I want to say a prehistoric creature, because of its long neck and hearty skull that not even a sledgehammer could drive it off. But they had to push it down back into the floor, and even then it still caused trouble, and once it ate all the fish, it just disappeared. And then it was never really brought up again. Of course, Norse sagas often have legendary creatures like this, so I believe this to be a prehistoric semi-aquatic animal. Maybe kind of like a Leopleurodon. That's the only animal I can think of right off the top of my head. Long neck, carnivore, had flippers, long, big flippers. So what they thought to be a seal was actually maybe a kind of dinosaur. So, with all of that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed the ghost story. It does show some... it's crazy how much the pagan omens still lived even in the Christian times. But what was even more interesting was a lesson was told here. And that lesson is, respect the last words of someone who's dying. Don't disrespect the dead or the dying. If they have the last wishes, please do what you can to honor it. Or else, as she said, there could be mishappenings all over to people who shouldn't or don't deserve it, as she said herself. With that, I do hope you guys enjoyed my story, and I do hope you guys are excited for the next one, because the next one actually does talk about Drengar, as it is from the saga of Grettir the Strong. And then after that, I'm going to make a video kind of going more into interconnections between different cultures and Days of the Dead, just like Samhain, the origin of Halloween, the Day of the Dead itself in South American aspects, and then you have the Wild Hunt in the northern, specifically Scandinavian roots. I do want to kind of look into all the different connections around the world with what it has with that, and the bridge between the spiritual world and our world fading into being able to reconnect not only with our loved ones who recently passed, but also our ancestors and the spirits of nature. Until then, everybody, I do hope you all have a wonderful day. I do hope you leave a like or a comment on what you thought of the story itself. And until then, I will see you all next time. See you soon, my friends.